Do you believe that when citizens don't vote, their votes are stolen? Is this even a possibility? Is it feasible to use the gaps in the list of voters to turn them into votes? What's more, it is also possible to artificially create these gaps and then fill them with more votes. But of all the changes to the electoral system, the most controversial, even among the leaders of the opposition itself, was the electronic voting system, the Smartmatic machine. Despite brutal government repression to prevent citizens from asserting their constitutional rights, the Venezuelan opposition finally calls for a referendum to revoke the presidential mandate. In the months leading up to the recall referendum, and according to most polls, there was a sudden change of tide. Chavez's popularity and that of his government had swung in his favor. The polling company North American Opinion Research, followed by Venezuelan pollsters such as Data Analysis, started to spread the word about the shift. North American Opinion Research was registered in Miami, Florida on March the 2nd of 2004. It's interesting to note that it shared the same address as Petrotulsa, a cooperative linked to the Chavista government providing services to the Venezuelan state-owned company PDVSA. Naturally, this reversal was very discouraging to the country's opposition, which has pinned its democratic aspirations on that referendum. However, not all pollsters were on the same page. A survey of professors from Venezuela's Central University College of Statistics predicted a sizable win for the opposition. When a national newspaper reported the results of the survey, that edition was taken out of circulation due to government pressure. What is Smartmatic? Who is Smartmatic?
You really can't miss it. The yellow button at the back of the Sequoia voting machine. Tens of thousands of machines used in 16 states and Washington, D.C. That button puts the machine in manual mode, so anyone can vote and repeatedly cast as many votes as they want. All sorts of electronic glitches are showing up. Screens display the wrong candidate when a button is pushed. Today in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, large print options didn't work properly, cutting off candidate names, and election officials struggled with other electronic snafus.
We just got notice from the Secretary of State's office today that some of our voting units will not be reflective of daylight savings time,
potentially causing the machines to close down early. Technicians from the voting companies are working to sort out the last-minute problems. Today, activists pointed out that Sequoia will again have Venezuelan nationalists as support workers on the electronic machines. That's in Cook County, Illinois. And the workers are project managers from Smartmatic, the Venezuelan company that bought Sequoia. Election officials say they have no way of knowing how many Venezuelans will be there on Election Day, but they've seen some around.
In the year 2000, a young Venezuelan engineer named Antonio Mujica registers Smartmatic's hardware and automation software with the United States Patents and Trademarks Office. That same year, from the same location in Boca Raton, Mujica also registers a company called Vista Corporation as an internet business service and software developer.
Prácticamente en control total de un centro de votación aquí en pequeñito dentro del Hilton para poder probar, jugar con las máquinas, transmitir, totalizar y incluso al final auditar todos los resultados junto con la data de totalización con una conexión al servidor del Consejo Nacional Electoral.
What nobody knew until the Miami newspaper El Nuevo Herald published its findings was that the Venezuelan government had invested $200,000 in Vista Corporation, effectively buying 28% of the company that would produce the software for the voting machines. The Venezuelan opposition, however, never spoke out, not so in other parts of the world where Smartmatic was being challenged. There was also no objection to the new voting system by the Carter Center, which was supposed to be the guarantor of transparency for the already murky Venezuelan elections. Just 7 months after Hugo Chávez's victory in the recall referendum, Smartmatic purchases Sequoia voting system, one of the largest voting automation companies in the world. The United States Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, alarmed by this purchase, sends a letter to the Secretary of the Treasury in which she says,
I am writing regarding possible investments by the Venezuelan government in Smartmatic, a voting machine company with business in the United States, and its acquisition of Sequoia.
If Smartmatic only had a one-room office with only one secretary, how could a company of that size buy a bigger and better established voting company like Sequoia? If so, how? Before the recall referendum, an audit was carried out, but it happened in the offices of Smartmatic, and it was the Electoral Council itself that unilaterally appointed the folks in charge of auditing the system, therefore violating the fundamental rule of any audit. The entity under review cannot review itself. Nor was it possible to carry out a comprehensive audit of the software and hardware of the voting machines. These improprieties are pointed out in the report by the Carter Center, which, in spite of that, gave the green light to the system. So under these adverse conditions in 2004, Venezuelans take part in the recall referendum. Of course, Hugo Chavez wins, and his victory is endorsed by the Carter Center.
The elections in Venezuela, although some people have criticized the result, which is Hugo Chavez having won, there's no doubt in our mind, having monitored very closely the election process, that he won fairly and squarely. As a matter of fact, of the 92 elections that we've monitored, I would say that the election process in Venezuela is the best in the world.
Is this suspicion enough to deduce that some form of manipulation took place? Could it be inferred that there was fraud and verified with a numerical method? When the numbers are truly random and represent measurable quantities like the length of a river, the numbers of inhabitants of a city, or the numbers of followers of Twitter accounts, the frequency of the first digit looks like this, and that of the second digit looks like that, as on the graph. When the numbers are simulated by a computer, they look like a graph. The difference is, in summary, that actual numbers trend towards the so-called Benford distribution, and computer-simulated numbers tend towards uniform distribution. But it wasn't until 1994 that an accounting professor named Mark Negrini proposed using the analysis of the frequencies of the first and second digits to detect possible fraud and irregularities. If the frequency of the first digit is the key to determining an irregularity, the second digit takes the findings to the next level. Using Benford's law, Mark Negrini uncovered such a fraud, the Enron case, one of the biggest business scandals in history.
The collapse of the Enron Corporation put thousands of employees out of work and cost investors billions in losses. Enron has become the leading symbol of corporate scandal. Today, a jury in Houston convicted former Enron executives Kenneth Lay and Jeffrey Skilling on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and related offenses. The judge also convicted Lay of bank fraud and false statements in a separate case tried to the bench. Lay, Skilling, and their numerous co-conspirators perpetrated an elaborate scheme to mislead analysts and investors about Enron's true financial picture.
The second-digit numbers of the Enron's balance sheets published by the Wall Street Journal violated Benford's law. The publication of this finding in an article instigated the opening of an investigation that resulted in the fall, due to fraud, of two large companies, Enron and its auditing company, Arthur Andersen. Over time, Benford's law became the numerical test par excellence for fraud detection. Nowadays, anyone scheming a fraud takes Benford's law into account. But of course, in 2004, at the time of the Venezuelan referendum, Benford's law was unknown and unthinkable because it is counterintuitive. Therefore, it was impossible that anyone could have foreseen it. A few weeks after the referendum, the Carter Center receives two allegations of fraud in reports showing that the number of no votes reported by the voting machines was anomalous because they didn't reflect Benford's law. The theoretical physicist Imre Mikus and the mathematicians Luis Raúl Perici and David Torres sent two separate studies to the Carter Center in which the results of the Venezuelan referendum of 2004 do show overwhelming anomalies. Both studies, similar to each other, were based on Benford's law. They no longer relied on the analysis of the first digit, but instead on the second, since the cap of voters per machine affected the behavior of the first digit. In the Perici-Torres study, for example, it was estimated that the probability that the no votes emitted by the voting machines in accordance with Benford's law, which is fulfilled by the votes of all elections, was practically non-existent, as unlikely as flipping 120 coins and all 120 coins showing heads. Something even more revealing appeared on the further second digits analysis. The pattern was just the same as those generated by computers. Houston, we've got another problem. So what does the Carter Center do with these studies based on Benford's law? They forward them to two experts from their staff, Dr. Henry Brady, who only observes the first digits of the current election and rejects these allegations of fraud, even though the work of Perici and Torres explains that to corroborate fraud, you should observe the behavior of the second digit and not the first. And they also forwarded the studies to Dr. Jonathan Taylor, who, observing how the second digits of the votes of two virtual elections that he generates in his computer violate Benford's law, concludes that the actual number of votes doesn't necessarily have to comply with Benford's law. And for that reason, it also disqualifies the allegations.
Forensics, it's a hopefully growing new field that combines political science with statistics, a little bit of law, a lot of computer science, and is really, really important.
But Dr. Walter Mebane, the most definite authority on electoral fraud, observed that none of the two mathematical models used by Taylor to generate results on his computer had the complexity necessary to produce the results that fulfilled Benford's law. It was unthinkable that for such an endeavor, an academic of Taylor's stature would use simulated numbers instead of real numbers. The Carter Center concluded, "It is the opinion of the Carter Center that the August 15th vote expressed the will of the Venezuelan electorate. The Center did not observe the credible evidence of fraud that would have changed the outcome of the election, and thus the cries of fraud were silenced for a time." Gustavo Delfino and Guillermo Salas, upon noticing this trend, posed the following hypothesis. In computerized centers, official results were forced to follow a linear relationship with respect to the numbers of signatures. This would be a way to subtract more than 1 million yes votes and add them to the no votes. The response Delfino and Salas received from the editors of Statistical Science, the journal to which they submitted their article, states,
"Your paper has been carefully reviewed by an editor and some expert referees. As you know, our plan is to publish this paper as part of a special section of analysis of the Venezuelan referendums. Please download the 3 reports on your paper, which you should use to guide your revision. The third report by Rodrigo Medina, a very impressive verification of your hypothesis."
Verification of the hypothesis of Delfino and Salas by Rodrigo Medina, doctor in physics. It is verified, in agreement with the hypothesis presented by Delfino and Salas, that the official results of the recall referendum of 2004 in each automated center were invented based on the number of signatures. The magnitude of the difference between the official results and the real results was estimated at 1,370,000 votes with an error of 20%. Venezuelans, such as Professor Luis Marin, a law professor at the Central University of Venezuela, felt a huge mistrust of the outsized use of technology. In his article, El Tonto de la Colina, an evident allusion to an opposition group that defends and supports the use of all this electoral technology, he states, "They want us to believe that all of this equipment, the Smartmatic, the fingerprint capture technology, the data transmission system, is there to defend your vote and my vote." For those who defend the Delfino and Salas hypothesis, the presence of the fingerprint capture technology in the voting centers existed for a very different reason than the regime's version. The fingerprint capture was just an excuse to place laptops permanently connected to satellite dishes a few meters away from the voting machines. This was an authentic Trojan horse to introduce a control system in the audited polling centers and monitor the voting in real time. As such, The government can include the data of millions of people, real or not, whose existence and identity are impossible to verify in the voting records. Needless to say, as of that moment, the source file that fed into the electoral registry began to expand in a shameless and extreme rate.
An 11-year-old boy just hacked into an imitation state voting website in less than 10 minutes, and he wasn't the only one. DEF CON is one of the world's largest hacker conferences where hackers and cybersecurity experts attempt to break into computer security systems. One of the conference's main purposes is to show how easy it is to manipulate software and hardware, and this year about 50 children ages 8 to 16 attended. One of the features at the event was the DEF CON Voting Machine Hacking Village, which included 13 websites that imitated voting sites from presidential battleground states. That's according to PBS. The 11-year-old boy was able to hack into an imitation of Florida's site in less than 10 minutes.
But the reality is that throughout the world, many refer to the Venezuelan elections as fraudulent. And it does not happen only in Venezuela, it happens in other parts of the world as well. In the 2012 presidential election, Barack Obama, like many other US citizens, cast his vote on a machine utilizing Smartmatic technology. A German court, in a single sentence, solves the dilemma of the voting machines. A citizen has the right to understand how he exercises his right to vote. An election cannot be an act of faith.